It was never meant to be found. The journals, 47 of them, were sealed in lead, hidden beneath the chapel floor. Not a soul had touched them in over a century, and when they were finally pried loose by demolition crews in the fall of 1848, the secrets they carried nearly burned through the gloves of the men who found them. Each journal bore the name of a girl, a student, a ghost. The entries inside, meticulous, vivid, and spiraling, spoke of things that never appeared in any report, never made it into any history book. Rites performed beneath stained glass shadows, men who arrived only after dark, girls who went upstairs, but never came back down. But the most terrifying discovery wasn't what happened to those girls. It was who knew. There, at the back of one journal, was a list. Names. Names of men, politicians, judges, clergy, etched in the exacting ink of a steady hand. Men you still read about in the halls of American power. Men whose descendants now pass laws, run universities, and bless institutions with ancient, rotting corruption. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts buried the case. Public safety concerns. Facade, they said. To this day, those records remain sealed, untouchable. But the truth was never erased, only hidden. And now, it begins to seep out like blood beneath the locked door of a room no one wants to enter. What I'm about to tell you is not folklore. This is documented, testified, buried under oath. But the Fairfax name, one of the oldest and most respected in American society, has long held the power to keep its nightmares behind curtains of stained velvet. Until now. So listen carefully. This is not just the story of a family. It is the story of a system, a machine of morality, constructed by monsters, baptized in virtue, and run on the innocence of the forgotten. The Fairfax family built an academy for girls. They said it was to uplift, to éduquer. What it became was a factory of submission. And if you're the kind of man who suspects there's more to history than what you've been taught, if you feel it, like a splinter in your mind, that the world has been designed to hide the worst of what it protects, then this story is yours now. But be warned, once you hear it, you will never look at power the same way again. It began, as so many horrors do, with good intentions and immaculate appearances. Salem, Massachusetts. The year was 1811. The town still staggered beneath the ghost of the witch trials, clawing for redemption in a nation that was redefining itself with each passing year. Its old Puritan guilt had been repackaged as moral progressivism, a hunger for order, decorum, control. Enter Victoria Fairfax. She arrived with lace gloves, a voice like scripture, and eyes the color of storm clouds, eyes that did not blink when others broke under silence. A widow, recently returned from London, armed with inheritance and ideology, she proposed a solution to Salem's troubled past. St. Mary's Academy for young ladies. On the surface, it was perfect. A finishing school in a crumbling mansion on Beacon Hill. Orphan girls taken in. Poor daughters educated for free. The elite sent their own children there too, drawn by Victoria's nobility, her British heirs, her promise to cultivate virtue in a world fraying at the seams. The town praised her. The bishop blessed her. No one asked why the property had sat abandoned for decades. No one questioned how she had acquired it for pennies. No one dug into the history of what had happened there before. They were too enchanted. They saw the chapel with its holy glass. They heard the hymns. They watched girls in uniform skirts walk in rows, obedient, silent, transformed. Discipline, they said, structure, righteousness. But something darker had entered with Victoria Fairfax. Something older than education, older than religion. Because here's the truth. She wasn't just building a school. She was building a cathedral for control. Beneath her polished manners, there was doctrine, an obsession with purification, submission, and the complete remaking of the female soul. The academy didn't educate. It eradicated. Everything that made those girls individuals, curiosity, desire, independence, was dismantled, one lesson at a time. And yet, the town applauded her. Because that's how it works. When corruption wears a corset and speaks with elegance, people call it morality. But Victoria Fairfax didn't act alone. There were others, family members who whispered rituals behind closed doors, men in high collars who came at night, whose names don't appear in any yearbooks. The Fairfax family believed in lineage, in purity, in preserving power through something more than money. And the girls? They were chosen, marked not for salvation, but for sacrifice. The academy opened its doors on a crisp September morning in 1811, just as the leaves began to turn. The air smelled of ink, candle wax, and freshly scrubbed limestone. Parents gathered in silence. Legislators smiled for portraits. Priests blessed the stone threshold as if it were a holy gateway. But for 23 girls, it was the end of freedom. Some arrived in carriages, others on foot. A few clutched tiny bundles of clothing, the only possessions they had. But every one of them crossed that threshold believing in a future they would never see. They were told they were lucky, chosen, saved. Among them, Margaret Sullivan, 14, the daughter of Irish immigrants lost in a tenement fire. Priscilla Morse, 15, orphaned by the sea. Hannah Whitmore, 13, abandoned after her father's imprisonment and her mother's disappearance. They came from nothing, and that made them perfect. You see, Victoria Fairfax didn't just want students. She wanted blank slates, girls with no protectors, no voices outside the stone walls, no one to ask questions when they vanished. The school provided food, shelter, clothing. In exchange, it demanded silence, obedience, and the slow erosion of the self. At first, it felt like order. The girls woke at 5 a.m. for chapel. They knelt on cold stone while Bartholomew Fairfax thundered about damnation, feminine frailty, and Satan's delight in unruly women. They ate in silence, bread and broth. They studied needlework, French, music, and religious texts. They slept beneath crucifixes bolted to the walls. Everything was clean, controlled, perfect, but something was off, a chill that never left. Whispers that didn't stop when the nuns passed, rooms that smelled of blood beneath the incense, and then the rooms on the 3rd floor. They called them meditation chambers, but no student who entered ever spoke of what happened there. Doors were locked from the outside. Curtains stayed drawn. Strange men were seen arriving after dark, slipping in through side entrances. They didn't look like clergy. They didn't act like guests. At first, no one questioned it. The girls were trained not to. To disobey was to be punished. To resist was to be broken. And they were, quietly, methodically, irreversibly. You need to understand, this wasn't a school. It was a breeding ground for control, a prototype for institutional obedience. A ritual house disguised as education. And the Fairfax name? It shielded everything, because when evil wears the mask of righteousness, people don't just look the other way. They kneel. It was a Tuesday morning when Margaret Sullivan first saw the blood. She was scrubbing the marble floor of the chapel, a punishment for hesitating too long before answering Sister Evangeline's question about the Psalms. The silence of the room was oppressive, thick with the scent of candle wax and dust. But as she moved the wet cloth across the stone, the rag turned red. At first, she thought it was a cut on her own hand, but her fingers were intact. Then she noticed the thin line of crimson running between the floorboards near the altar, the place where girls knelt every morning, weeping under the weight of prayers they didn't understand. Margaret froze. The air felt colder suddenly, as if something unseen had entered the chapel. She looked up. The stained glass eyes of Saint Cecilia stared down at her in silence. The saints couldn't speak, and neither could she. That afternoon, a new rule was posted. No students permitted in the chapel, unsupervised. The rule came too late. Margaret wasn't the only one who had seen things. Shadows moving when no one was there. Strange stains on the robes used during special instruction. And girls who returned from the third floor with their eyes glassy and lips trembling. But no one said a word. Because punishment came swiftly. You weren't beaten. That would leave marks. Instead, they starved you. They isolated you in the cold meditation room, hours on your knees in silence, until your body trembled and your mind frayed. You were told you were broken, filthy, unworthy. And eventually, you believed it. The girls learned quickly to watch without reacting, to hear without listening, to endure without memory. And those men, the ones who came at night in unmarked carriages, they never spoke to the students directly, but they watched, always watched. Through cracked doors and frosted glass, Margaret saw glimpses. Fine coats, silver rings, one with a gold pocket watch he never stopped flipping open and shut. Their presence was never announced, but the next morning a girl would be missing from class. The excuse was always the same: sent home, ill, withdrawn. But they never returned, not one. Margaret began to keep a list, scratching names beneath her mattress with a sharpened hairpin. 8 girls, all gone within 6 months. And the chapel? No longer a sanctuary. It had become something else. A stage, a chamber, a threshold between obedience and disappearance. It was then she realized this was not discipline, this was not religion, this was ritual. By the spring of 1814, Margaret Sullivan no longer believed she was simply a student. She was something else now, something sharpened, watching, listening, cataloging every quiet horror wrapped in the polite language of morality. The Academy called it refinement, but the truth, it was a machine, refining girls like ore, stripping them of resistance until they gleamed with silent compliance. But Margaret hadn't broken, not yet. And neither had Sarah Peaton. Sarah was pale, with eyes too large for her narrow face. She hardly spoke in class, but Margaret noticed how her gaze moved, intelligent, skeptical, hungry for something true. Sarah had survived 2 special instruction sessions. She never cried, but her hands trembled constantly now, and her appetite had vanished. One night, as the wind howled across Salem Harbor, Margaret slipped into the meditation room where Sarah sat in forced silence. And she whispered 3 words. "Do you remember?" Sarah didn't answer immediately, but her eyes widened and her shoulders tensed. Margaret repeated it, softer this time. Sarah nodded. That nod, small, nearly imperceptible, was the first true connection Margaret had made in over a year. It was then that something changed. The girls began to communicate in symbols. A folded corner on a prayer book meant, "They're watching." A half-finished braid meant, "Someone's missing." A ribbon tied on the wrong wrist meant, "Meet me." The academy hadn't crushed their spirits. Not completely. It had simply taught them how to hide. Through whispered scraps and midnight gestures, Margaret and Sarah built a quiet resistance, documenting the strange rituals, the names of visiting men, the nights when screams echoed through the floorboards. And what they uncovered? It went deeper than anyone feared. The visitors weren't just local politicians or wealthy patrons. Some came from as far as Boki, Stone, and New York. Always powerful, always men with something to lose. They weren't just watching the rituals. They were financing them. They were participating. And behind them all was Victoria Fairfax. The chapel wasn't just a place of worship. It was a stage for ceremonies older than Christianity, rituals cloaked in scripture, designed not for salvation, but for domination. Margaret read a passage once, buried in a rotting book left in the attic. "She who governs the innocent in shadow shall reign in silence among the mighty." It was written in Latin, underlined in blood. She copied it, carved it into the back of her bedpost. If this was a school, it was one for the elite's darkest impulses, training girls to be vessels, pawns, sacrifices. And Margaret? She would either burn it to the ground or be buried beneath it. By midsummer of 1814, the academy no longer smelled like lemon oil and lavender. The corridors carried the scent of mildew, candle smoke, and fear. Something old and rotting had seeped into the walls. Margaret could feel it. The place itself was changing, like it had absorbed too much suffering and could no longer disguise what it was. The Fairfax family was no longer hiding behind charm. They didn't need to. The town had stopped asking questions. 3 more girls had died since spring, all orphans, all with no known relatives. Their deaths were recorded as consumptive decline. But Margaret had seen the signs. She had washed the linens stained with blood, held their hands as they convulsed in sleep, heard their muttered prayers to a God who clearly wasn't listening. And Constance Hartwell was starting to see it too. She wasn't like the others. She asked questions, too many. She spoke to the girls gently, directly, like she actually saw them. When Sarah faltered during her lessons, Miss Hartwell adjusted the curriculum. When Margaret came to class with her hand bandaged, she didn't accept the lie about a gardening accident. She watched. She waited. And one day she asked, "Do you trust me?" Margaret stared at her, silent, then nodded. That night, Constance followed Margaret to the edge of the chapel courtyard, where, beneath loose stones in the foundation, they had hidden scraps of notes, charcoal sketches of strange symbols and names of the men who came through the side entrance. Hartwell read every line. Then she whispered, "This is bigger than Salem." Margaret said nothing, because she already knew. Fairfax's power didn't end at the academy gate. The ritualized abuse of these girls was not an isolated perversion. It was systemic, institutional, cultivated by powerful men who wore the robes of bishops, the rings of senators, the black coats of judges, and the academy was their greenhouse. Hartwell began to plan. She had connections, journalists in Boston, women's advocates in New York. She promised Margaret that she would get the word out, that someone would come. But Margaret had learned not to believe in rescue. That kind of hope was for girls who didn't understand what power looks like when it's inherited, protected, and ritualized. Still, she agreed to help. They copied the records. They mapped the hidden rooms. They documented every wound, every whispered memory, every half-remembered chant. They were no longer just students. They were archivists of the unholy. Margaret knew they had little time. Victoria Fairfax had begun to suspect something. Her smiles were tighter, her sermons more pointed. She had started quoting Revelation more than Psalms, and she had begun personally inspecting the dormitories at night. One evening she stood over Margaret's bed, silent. Then she whispered, "The ones who ask questions burn the longest," and left. Margaret didn't sleep that night, because she understood the house was alive, and it was hungry. It was the night of the harvest moon, October 3rd, 1814, when the Academy finally turned on Constance Hartwell. It began with silence. Not the ordinary stillness of bedtime prayers, or the creaking hush of autumn wind through old walls, but a suffocating silence that seemed to press against the windows, as if the very air had been evacuated from the building. The lamps dimmed without reason. The girls reported hearing a low hum, like chanting through stone. Margaret knew something was coming. She had seen Bartholomew Fairfax in the garden at dusk, kneeling, eyes closed, hands stained with ash. He had carved something into the earth with a silver blade, not a cross, something older, curved, serpentine. When she asked Evangeline what it meant, the woman only smiled and said, "We all return to the womb eventually." That night, Constance never arrived at dinner. No explanation, no announcement. By morning, her quarters had been cleared. Her books, her letters, even her inkstand, all gone. Only one thing remained, a scrap of fabric tucked beneath Margaret's mattress, a torn piece of parchment wrapped in linen. On it, Constance had written in trembling script, "If they find this, I'm already ash. Burn the floor beneath the chapel. That's where the truth lies. C.H." Margaret didn't cry. She didn't scream. She read the note once, twice, then tucked it into her bodice and went to class, because now, she knew, there would be no rescue. Not from Boston, not from God. There would only be fire. Over the next 4 days, the Academy slipped into something darker than secrecy. It became ritual. The girls were awakened at midnight, ushered barefoot into the chapel, and forced to kneel for hours, as Bartholomew read from a black-bound book, whose words turned the air sour. Margaret watched, as the youngest girls began to bleed from their noses, faint or convulse. Evangeline moved, stood among them, with a bowl of crushed lavender and laudanum, forcing each girl to inhale. "We are preparing them," she murmured, "for what lies beneath." And then the digging began. Workmen, silent, blank-eyed, and wearing cassocks, appeared under cover of fog. They entered through the orchard gate. No one in town saw them, or if they did, they said nothing. By the 5th night, they had removed the entire chapel floor. Beneath the flagstones, stone steps descending into earth, carved centuries ago. Not American, not even colonial. Older, pre-Christian, runes lined the walls, symbols that bled when touched. The place smelled of brine and rot, as if a sea that never existed had drowned the ground below. Victoria Fairfax stood at the top of the steps, arms outstretched. "This," she said, "is the purpose for which you were chosen." No one spoke, not even Margaret. But her hand was already gripping a rusted fire iron from the hearth, and her mind had chosen. "If I must die, I will not go quietly." What Margaret Sullivan saw beneath the chapel was not meant for human eyes. The descent was steep, 39 steps carved into black limestone, worn smooth by centuries of footfalls. Not a cellar, not a crypt, something far more ancient. The air grew colder with each step and thicker, as if the darkness had weight. Torches lined the walls, but their flames burned with a blue hue, unnatural and flickering, as if resisting the space they illuminated. At the bottom, a chamber, circular, vast, and silent, except for the slow drip of moisture from the ceiling and the rhythmic breathing of the congregation already assembled. There were no pews, no altar, just 13 stone chairs, arranged like the points of a clock, and at their center, a shallow pit filled with dark water that reflected nothing. Above it, a circular opening in the ceiling allowed the moonlight to pour through. Perfectly aligned, perfectly timed. Victoria Fairfax stood at the edge of the pit. Her black robes were embroidered not with crosses, but with coiling serpents, stitched in silver thread. At her feet knelt 6 of the youngest students, eyes glazed, arms limp, each wearing white burial gowns. Their wrists bore the faint pink lines of something recent, something ritualistic. Bartholomew began to speak, not in English, not in Latin. It was a language Margaret had never heard, guttural, sibilant, reverberating unnaturally against the chamber walls. As he chanted, the water in the pit began to ripple, then churn, then rise. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. From the water emerged not a form, but a presence, a scent, a sound that was not a sound, but a vibration in her bones. It spoke directly into her mind, bypassing all language. Witness. And then it showed her. Flashes, visions, centuries of sacrifice. Girls led down the same stairs, bound, offered, always 13, always the same fae. Millies, the Fairfax bloodline, keepers of the threshold. Their role? To nourish what lies beneath, to keep it dreaming. Hungry, but contained. But something had changed. It wanted more. It was waking. Margaret stumbled back, but 2 hands gripped her shoulders. Evangeline. Her voice was soft, almost loving. This is what your suffering was for, dear one. You were chosen. Margaret didn't scream. She moved. She drove the iron poker into Evangeline's ribs with all her strength. The woman's gasp was sharp but brief. Blood soaked the floor. The congregation broke into chaos. The spell shattered. The water screamed. The pit collapsed inward. Margaret ran, grabbing 2 girls by the hand as she climbed the stairs. Behind her, the chamber convulsed. Stone cracked. Flames surged from the torches. The ceiling began to cave. She didn't look back. As she burst into the chapel above, the world tilted. Cries rang out below. The floor groaned, and then silence. The academy had swallowed itself. The doors burst open. Margaret emerged into the dawn. She was the only one who would speak of what had happened. But even she would never tell the whole story, because some truths aren't meant to be survived. Margaret Sullivan emerged from St. Mary's Academy, not as a girl, no longer as a victim, but as something forged in fire, horror, and unspeakable knowledge. The local constables who arrived hours later found only ruins. The 3rd floor had collapsed inward. The chapel was blackened. Of the Fairfax family, no trace remained. No bodies, no remains. Just ashes and cracked stone. Margaret's statement was brief. A gas leak, an accident, perhaps faulty architecture. That's what she told them. That's what they were willing to believe. But in private, in the margins of a notebook she never let leave her side, she wrote the truth. Every ritual, every name, every face, every night she spent in that cursed institution. She wrote not for justice, but for memory. Because deep down, she knew this was not the end. The Fairfax legacy had not perished in the fire. It had scattered. That same week, a closed carriage was seen departing Salem under cover of fog, heading west toward the Ohio frontier. No driver, no passengers that anyone could see, but the horses moved like they were being guided. Inside that carriage were 3 small leather-bound books, journals, sealed with wax, stamped with the Fairfax crest, a serpent coiled around a chalice. And within a month, rumors began to swirl in Wisconsin of a new academy opening in the outskirts of Prairie du Chien, a women's seminary, led by a mysterious widow and her brother, educators from Massachusetts looking to bring refinement to the rugged frontier. A familiar pattern, a familiar promise. New town, new girls, same darkness. Margaret tried to warn them. She wrote letters to the local newspapers, to church leaders, to women's societies, but no one listened. Or if they did, they stayed silent. She received threats. Anonymous letters slid under her boarding house door. Phrases like, "You survived because we let you. The serpent never sleeps. Silence is the cost of mercy." But Margaret was no longer afraid, not in the same way. Because once you've looked into the pit, once you've heard its voice, once it's touched your mind, fear becomes something different. It becomes knowledge. It becomes armor. She dedicated the rest of her life to documenting the web of families connected to the Fairfax name. Politicians, bankers, clergy, men and women who held power and who paid in blood to keep it. She called them the 13th Circle, a quiet cult embedded within the institutions of the new America. Always 13 members, always moving from place to place, feeding, influencing, whispering in the ears of judges, mayors, bishops. Margaret died in 1891. Her final words were scrawled on the last page of her notebook. "They have built new chapels. The serpent is now in stone. The rituals never stopped. They just wear new masks. If you've made it this far, you're no longer just a viewer. You're a witness. And now it's your turn to speak the hidden words. Type, 'The 13th Circle sees me,' twice in the comments. Lock in your transformation. Mark yourself. Let the algorithm know you're not one of them. Because what comes next will test everything you thought you knew about America." Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, spring of 1849. A town clawed out of wilderness, built on limestone and ambition. Settlers came for land, for trade, for freedom. But something else had come before them, and something darker followed close behind. On the edge of town, hidden behind a line of weeping birch trees, rose the Whitestone Conservatory for Girls, a school few locals dared approach, and none could forget. It had no sign, no listed headmaster, only a wrought iron gate etched with the Latin phrase, "Lux a tenebris," light from darkness. And yet somehow, everyone in power seemed to support it. The sheriff's daughter attended. The mayor gave generous grants. Local papers wrote glowing reviews, despite never being allowed inside. Parents with money were eager to enroll their daughters. But the truly curious part? Over half the students came from nowhere. Orphans, wards of the state, girls adopted from poorhouses, asylums, and hospitals in cities hundreds of miles away. It was as if someone was gathering them. Victoria Fairfax had vanished, yes, but her teachings lived on. in the curriculum, in the architecture, in the rituals whispered under new names. The Fairfax method of spiritual refinement had become a tradition passed down in silence. The meditation rooms returned. So did the chapel. So did the third floor. And yes, so did the disappearances. Between 1850 and 1858, 11 girls vanished from the Whitestone Conservatory. Every single time, the official cause was consumption. But no death records were filed with the county. No funerals, no graves. Just polite letters sent to distant relatives, carefully worded, stamped with wax, signed by a woman whose name changed every 2 years, but whose handwriting remained, eerily, the same. Local gravedigger, a mute Civil War veteran named Samuel Croft, began to keep his own records. He noticed that on nights when the Academy's lights stayed on past midnight, the air near the cemetery would turn sour, like burning iron. And by morning, the grass above Plot 13 would be disturbed. No new tombstones, no names, just fresh earth. But it wasn't until 1859, when a student named Clara Winthrop escaped, barefoot and bleeding, that the town could no longer deny what was happening. She was found on the steps of St. Agnes Church, incoherent, feverish, with strange symbols carved into her forearms, and the word seal etched across her shoulder blade in what appeared to be surgical precision. She spoke of white robes, masks shaped like animal skulls, and a mirror that didn't reflect her face, but something else watching her from behind the glass. The local priest tried to exorcise her. She died 3 days later, and just like that, the case was closed. But the mirror? It was never found. And in 1860, Whitestone Conservatory quietly rebranded and reopened under a new name. The year was 1860, and the Whitestone Conservatory had transformed, emerging as the St. Cecilia's Institute for Ladies, a facade as pristine as freshly fallen snow. But beneath the polished veneer of stained glass and iron-wrought balconies, the same shadows lingered, thicker and darker than before. The town had turned a blind eye, convinced that the sins of the past were buried alongside those vanished girls. But they were wrong. Victoria Fairfax's legacy wasn't a relic. It was a blueprint, a template for control and silence, perfected over decades. The elite families who financed the institute operated like an unspoken council, each member bound by blood oaths and a code so old it predated the American Revolution. This was no longer just a school. It was a machine of psychological manipulation disguised as salvation. Underneath St. Cecilia's, hidden by false walls and locked vaults, lay a network of chambers, rooms coated in ash, candle wax, and dried blood. The meditation rooms had evolved into something far more sinister, ritualistic sanctuaries where obedience was carved into flesh and loyalty was bought with fear. The students, mostly daughters of the powerful, were subjected to indoctrination that fractured their identities. Each day began before dawn with a ceremony of blindfolded prayer, chanting in languages no one understood. Resistance was met with isolation, weeks spent in solitary confinement, deprived of light, sound, and human contact. But the real horror was the consecration rite, a secret ceremony held once a year during the winter solstice. Few outsiders knew of it, fewer still witnessed it. The rite was designed to strip the girls of their wills, binding them to the family's dark covenant. It involved a hall of mirrors, each reflecting not the present, but the fractured shadows of their souls. Those who failed the rite simply disappeared. Aimed by the Institute as having graduated into a higher state of grace, though the truth was far more chilling. One girl, Evelyn Harrow, survived the consecration rite, only to be found months later, wandering the forests, miles from town, her mind shattered, repeating a single phrase over and over. The light devours the shadow, but the shadow whispers back. Her testimony was dismissed as madness. But I ask you, what if it wasn't madness? What if it was a warning? Now pause here. If you're still with me, I want you to type this phrase twice in the comments. Shadow whispers, light devours. Shadow whispers, light devours. This locks in your transformation. It aligns you with the hidden knowledge that most would kill to keep buried. Comment it now. Let the truth seep into you. Because the deeper we go, the more dangerous the truths become. And the Fairfax family's sinister legacy was far from finished. Evelyn Harrow's fragmented whispers echoed far beyond the woods where she was found. Her descent into madness wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of the Institute's unholy grip on its wards. St. Cecilia's was less a school and more a labyrinth of shadows, designed to break and rebuild souls in the Fairfax mold. Behind locked doors and heavy oak paneling, secrets festered like wounds, refused to heal. The Institute's Board of Governors, descendants and affiliates of the Fairfax bloodline, met in smoke-filled chambers to orchestrate plans that reached far beyond Salem's boundaries. They controlled not only the fates of their students, but held sway over town officials, judges, and even law enforcement. Every disappearance, every whispered rumor of mistreatment was buried under layers of influence and intimidation. Victims who dared to speak were discredited, labeled hysterical, or vanishing under mysterious circumstances themselves. A pattern emerged. Those who threatened to expose the truth were systematically silenced, erased from history, like bad ink on a sacred manuscript. The psychological control employed was as methodical as it was brutal. Girls were subjected to relentless cycles of praise and punishment, their sense of self dismantled piece by piece. Isolation in the meditation chambers bred dependency, while Bartholomew Fairfax's sermons drilled into their minds a doctrine of absolute obedience and fear of divine wrath. Yet beneath this oppressive exterior, a subtle resistance took root. Evelyn's shattered mind contained fragments of clarity that she passed on to others in fleeting moments of lucidity. Coded messages hidden in hymnals, secret glances during prayer. These acts of defiance were small, but they sparked a fire in the hearts of the oppressed. And in the darkest corners of the Institute, a silent rebellion was gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to ignite. But the Fairfax family, with their ancient ties to occult knowledge and political power, anticipated such unrest. Their network extended into secret societies and clandestine orders that practiced rituals older than the Republic itself, rituals steeped in blood, power, and control. They were the gatekeepers of a forbidden knowledge that demanded sacrifice, submission, and silence. The more you learn, the more you realize this is not just a story of vanished girls or corrupted institutions. It is a glimpse into a vast web of manipulation designed to shape the very fabric of society. You are peeling back the layers of a dark legacy that thrives on secrecy and fear. Remember to comment the phrase if you haven't yet. Shadow whispers, light devours. Shadow whispers, light devours. Because the next revelations will test your resolve. Are you ready? The walls of St. Cecilia's held more than echoes. They trapped the pain, the screams, and the silent despair of countless girls who had walked its halls before Evelyn. Each stone, each cracked floorboard, bore witness to rituals that defied the bounds of morality and reason. The Fairfax family, masters of disguise and deception, had woven an unholy tapestry, blending religious piety with ancient occult rites, hidden beneath a veneer of sanctity. Bartholomew Fairfax, once a traveling preacher with a reputation for fire and brimstone sermons, was more than a spiritual guide. He was the executor of the family's darkest designs. His sermons didn't just preach obedience, they shattered wills. He used fear as a scalpel, dissecting the girls' minds until all resistance was drained, replaced by hollow devotion. The meditation chambers on the third floor were not sanctuaries, but chambers of indoctrination and torture, disguised as spiritual reflection. The mysterious nightly visitors, those well-dressed men arriving in unmarked carriages, were not mere patrons or admirers. They were the elite, the powerful puppeteers who demanded their share of the Fairfax's macabre enterprise. Under flickering torchlight, they watched, judged, and participated in ceremonies whose true nature was masked by layers of symbolism and arcane language. These men, bound by oaths older than America itself, ensured that the cycle of corruption, sacrifice, and control continued unbroken. The journals discovered decades later, hidden beneath the chapel floor, chronicled the ordeal in chilling detail. They revealed the names of these men, senators, judges, industrial magnates, all complicit in the institution's sinister practices. The pages spoke of rites involving blood, whispered incantations in dead languages, and the ultimate subjugation of young souls in exchange for power and influence. But the true horror lay not only in the acts committed, but in the machinery that perpetuated them. A system designed to erase memory, enforce silence, and twist innocence into obedience. Psychological control was paramount. The girls were broken through deprivation, isolation, and the careful orchestration of hope and despair. Each death was framed as divine judgment, a sacrifice to maintain the fragile illusion of purity and progress. Yet resistance simmered beneath the surface. Margaret Sullivan, once vibrant and hopeful, had become a beacon of covert defiance. Using coded hymns and secret meetings, she and a small group of survivors began piecing together a plan to expose the Fairfax family's crimes. This was not just history. It was a warning. The forces that built St. Cecilia's and allowed its horrors to fester still move unseen today. Hidden in plain sight, cloaked by respectability and tradition, they thrive on the silence of the masses. If you have not yet locked in your awareness, type now. Shadow whispers, light devours. Shadow whispers, light devours. This is no longer just a tale. It is a call to awaken. The spring of 1814 brought with it an unsettling stillness at St. Cecilia's Academy. The once bustling corridors had become corridors of silence, an eerie quiet that suffocated hope. The girls moved like shadows, their eyes vacant, their bodies weakened by the invisible chains of control that tightened with each passing day. The academy was no longer a place of learning. It had transformed into a cage forged from fear, ritual, and deception. Victoria Fairfax, the matriarch, maintained her icy composure. To the outside world, she was the epitome of Christian charity, a widow who devoted her life to raising young women into respectable members of society. But behind closed doors, she was the architect of their torment. Her steel-gray eyes revealed nothing, yet held the cold calculation of a woman who saw these girls not as individuals, but as instruments of power, sacrificial pawns in a game that transcended morality. Bartholomew's sermons grew harsher, his voice a whip cracking through the chapel's hollow air. He preached that salvation demanded suffering, that purity was forged only in pain and obedience. Each girl's spirit was meticulously eroded, their minds reshaped to accept a reality where questioning was blasphemy and rebellion meant annihilation. The meditation rooms on the 3rd floor became chambers of dread. Here, the girls endured hours of isolation, facing not only their fears, but also the insidious rituals conducted by the secretive visitors. The men who arrived cloaked in shadows were no longer mere spectators. They were predators feasting on innocence, their influence reaching into every corner of the Academy's hidden world. The rumors spread quietly, whispers of strange symbols etched into walls, cryptic chants in dead tongues, and the chilling sight of white-clad girls disappearing into the night, never to return. Some spoke of unmarked graves in T, forest beyond the Academy, places where the past was buried alongside broken souls. Margaret Sullivan's leadership in the underground network became a flicker of defiance in the darkness. She coordinated secret gatherings, passing information through coded hymns and discreet notes, striving to awaken her peers to the reality they were trapped in. But the price of resistance was high. Discovery meant punishment beyond physical pain, erasure from memory, exile into madness, or worse. And yet, the Academy's facade endured. Letters of praise flowed to the Fairfax family. Donations arrived from influential supporters, and the local press lauded the institution as a beacon of virtue and education. The truth was carefully concealed behind a wall of lies, fear, and complicity. This wasn't merely an isolated nightmare, but a reflection of a broader system, one where power used faith as a mask and innocence became currency. Now, as you watch this, you are standing at a crossroads. The knowledge you seek can be a key or a chain. If you are ready to break the cycle, type again. Shadow whispers, light devours. Shadow whispers, light devours. The journey grows darker from here. Are you prepared to continue deeper into the Fairfax family's sinister legacy? Shall I continue with Section 15? The arrival of Constance Hartwell was meant to be a beacon of change, a fresh breeze stirring the stagnant air of St. Cecilia's Academy. A woman educated in progressive ideals, trained to inspire critical thought and intellectual freedom. Yet, even her sharp mind could not immediately grasp the depth of the darkness she had stepped into. From her first days, Constance sensed an unnatural silence gripping the girls, a silence born not of respect, but of fear. Attempts to spark curiosity or question the dogma were met with blank stares or hurried warnings from the Fairfax sisters. The girls' responses were rehearsed, mechanical. They had been stripped not only of their innocence, but of their very will. Constance's investigations, subtle at first, grew bolder. She noted how the meditation rooms were off limits, how strange visitors slipped in and out unseen, and how the health of the students deteriorated inexplicably. But each question she raised was deflected by Victoria's calm, calculated reassurances, or Bartholomew's stern sermons on divine purpose. Late one night, drawn by whispers and muffled sobs, Constance found herself outside the chapel. Peering through the stained glass windows, she saw flickering torchlight casting twisted shadows, shadows that danced in sync with the haunting chants echoing through the chamber. The ritual unfolding inside was beyond anything she had imagined. Girls clad in white, their faces pale and haunted, encircled by well-dressed men whose eyes held a hunger colder than the Massachusetts winter. Terrified but resolute, Constance resolved to uncover the full truth. she began discreetly gathering what scraps of evidence she could: fragments of journals, whispered confessions from the bravest girls, hints of a hidden ledger listing names she dared not read aloud. Every piece pointed to a conspiracy, not only within the academy, but woven onto the fabric of Salem's elite. But the cost of her defiance was swift and brutal. The Fairfax family, masters of manipulation and intimidation, moved quickly to isolate her, cutting off her allies, smearing her reputation, and ensuring that no one would listen to the outsider questioning their sacred mission. Constance's plight was a stark reminder. The true power of the Fairfax legacy lay not just in their wealth or status, but in their ability to control narratives, to silence dissent, and to bury the darkest secrets beneath layers of reverence and fear. Yet even as the walls closed in, Constance's courage planted a seed, one that would grow over decades into whispers of rebellion, investigations, and the eventual unmasking of the Academy's horrific truth. Her story, much like the girls she tried to save, is a testament to the price paid when innocence confronts corruption, and the price demanded by those who seek to expose it. The deeper you delve, the clearer it becomes. History is never innocent. It is written by victors who hide their sins behind pious words. Remember, if you want to seal this transformation, write again. Shadow whispers, light devours. Shadow whispers, light devours. This knowledge changes everything. The fall of Constance Hartwell was not the end. It was merely the turning point in a dark saga that stretched far beyond the walls of St. Cecilia's Academy. After her forced departure, a silence swept through the halls, a silence heavier than grief, thicker than despair. The girls were left to wither beneath the unyielding gaze of the Fairfax family, their spirits fractured and their bodies fading. But in the shadows, a different kind of resistance began to take root. Stories once whispered in fear became the murmurs of a growing network of survivors, former students, and even servants who had witnessed the horrors but lived to tell. These fragmented testimonies, scattered like embers in the wind, were the sparks that would eventually ignite the flame of truth. Unknown to the town's elite, the Fairfax's grip on power was not just maintained through wealth or public piety, but through a complex web of influence that reached into courts, clergy, and politics. The lead-lined box discovered decades later was no accident. It was a coffin for secrets too dangerous to expose, a vault of pain and betrayal meticulously hidden beneath the chapel floor. The journals it contained were chilling, a litany of abuses, detailed and precise, chronicling not only the suffering of the girls, but the names of men who had crossed through those secret entrances, names that were whispered in the halls of power, their faces untouchable by law or justice. These pages, stained with ink and tears, told of rituals that blurred the lines between faith and fanaticism, of psychological torment designed to break bodies and minds alike, and of a calculated system of control that ensured silence, through fear, through favor, or through fatal consequence. The Academy was a crucible where innocence was sacrificed on the altar of corrupted influence. It was a place where virtue was weaponized, where religion became a mask for something far more sinister. The Fairfax family, once revered as benefactors and educators, were the architects of a nightmare that seeped into the very foundation of Salem's society. Yet even as decades passed, the echoes of that nightmare refused to be silenced. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors into investigations, and investigations into undeniable truth. And now the story rests in your hands. You've been pulled into the abyss, shown the twisted machinery of power and deception that few dare to confront. But knowledge is a weapon, and you hold it now. Keep your eyes open. Trust no facade. The shadows are watching. The truth doesn't just free you, it changes you. If you are ready to cement this transformation, type once more, loudly and with intent. Shadow whispers, light devours. Shadow whispers, light devours. You're no longer a bystander. The years that followed the Academy's closure were marked by a deliberate erasure of history. The Fairfax name, though tarnished in whispered circles, remained a pillar in Salem's upper crust. Their vast estates, hidden correspondences, and influential allies shielded them from justice. The lead-lined box and its journals were locked away, relegated to classified archives, dismissed as mere legend by the public. But beneath this veneer of denial, a slow-burning reckoning was underway. Descendants of those lost girls, burdened with fragmented memories, passed down in silence, began piecing together the puzzle. Scholars, investigative journalists, and occult historians sensed the undercurrents of a far-reaching conspiracy entwined with the early American elite. The Academy was not an anomaly. It was a symptom, a testament to how power, cloaked in the garb of religion and respectability, could corrupt institutions and warp innocence for its own gain. It was a dark mirror reflecting a society willing to sacrifice its most vulnerable to preserve order and control. Psychological manipulation was just one thread in this web. The rituals, the disappearances, the coercion, they were mechanisms to consolidate power, to ensure absolute obedience, and to silence dissent. The girls were not only victims, they were weapons, broken down and reshaped to serve a hidden agenda, a shadow governance that controlled both spirit and body. Today, the Fairfax legacy whispers still, in forgotten archives, in the eerie silence of abandoned buildings, and in the subtle marks etched into Salem's cobblestone streets. Their story warns us. The past is never truly dead. It lurks beneath, shaping the present in unseen ways. This knowledge carries a weight few can bear. It demands vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to uncover the suppressed truths hiding in plain sight. You've come far in this descent. The shadows no longer frighten you. They sharpen your vision. To solidify your awakening, speak these words aloud, your voice a beacon in the darkness. Shadow whispers, light devours. Shadow whispers, light devours. Your journey is not over. This is the final descent, the unveiling of the Fairfax family's ultimate secret, one that reaches far beyond Salem's haunted streets, stretching into the fabric of power itself. In the years following the Academy's destruction, secret societies whispered of the Fairfax bloodline's strange rituals, rites passed down through generations. These rites were not mere superstition. They were calculated exercises in psychological control, designed to harness and manipulate spiritual energy, bending human will to an invisible hand. The Fairfax family did not simply corrupt an institution. They engineered a system of dominance disguised as salvation, where the most vulnerable were both victims and vessels, their pain harvested, their obedience weaponized. The Academy was a crucible, an altar to a dark covenant, sealed in shadows. Documents, long buried, reveal meetings between Fairfax descendants and powerful figures in politics, finance, and religion, a network that ensured the family's influence would persist, unchallenged, shaping laws and narratives to conceal their sins. The true horror lies in this. Institutions we trust, education, religion, governance, can be twisted into prisons of control, hiding ancient corruption beneath their polished surfaces. The missing girls, the silent screams, the lead boxes sealed beneath the floors. These are echoes of a system that survives today in new forms. Invisible hierarchies that manipulate, suppress, and erase inconvenient truths. But knowledge is power. The deeper you look, the more you unravel the threads of deception that bind society. The Fairfax tale is a warning and a call to arms, to question authority, to seek forbidden knowledge, and to reclaim sovereignty over your own mind and spirit. The darkness you've glimpsed is real, but so is the light you carry, the power to resist, to awaken, to expose what others wish, to remain hidden. You are no longer a passive observer. You are a guardian of truths, once buried and forbidden. Hold this knowledge close. It will change you forever. Thank you for walking this shadowed path. Stay vigilant, stay relentless, and remember, shadow whispers, light devours. This is only the beginning.